Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America. On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, we talk to prominent US citizens not just about their country's past and present, but also about its future. What, I ask my American guests, will be the 21st century fate of their now venerable republic? Hello everybody, welcome back to Keen on America. Today we talk with the legendary American journalist Ray Suarez, and as always on Keen on America, I began by asking Ray where and when he was born.
I'm Ray Suarez. I was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1957.
Do you think of yourself, Ray, as an American?
Yeah, perhaps a hyphenated American, sometimes an ambivalent American, but I'm definitely a product of this country and this culture.
What is a hyphenated American?
Well, someone who is of the United States, but also has an aspect of themselves that might be associated with someplace else on the planet. My family came to the American mainland from Puerto Rico in the early 1950s, and even if I thought of myself as a Yankee Doodle, red, white, and blue American, there would be an identity imposed on me by others, by the perception of me as a Puerto Rican. So rather than fight it, I just go with it.
Aren't all Americans hyphenated?
It feels like it used to be more common. And then a lot of people started to reject the idea of hyphenation. And if you look at the Census Bureau, every 10 years they report a fairly substantial number of people just put down as their origin American.
Tell me about your parents.
My mother was born in Brooklyn. My father was born in Aguadilla, which is a city on the northwest coast of Puerto Rico. And they were strivers, hardworking people, people who figured out a way to get 26 cents out of every quarter. My father was a barber for many years until my teenage years, and those were the years when men stopped getting haircuts very often, and he had to quickly change jobs. He sold the barbershop and bought a store, and I worked behind the counter of that store to put myself through college. My mother was a school aide, sometimes called a paraprofessional. She worked in the New York City public schools until I was well into my adult years.
Are you suggesting, Ray, that the counterculture put barbers out of business?
Well, yeah. I mean, even people who wouldn't think of themselves as countercultural just looked around at who else was on the street. Men went from getting a haircut, whether they needed it or not, and going to the barber to get a shave, to coming in once a month, if that. And I used to go to my father's barbershop from time to time when I was a young adolescent. I'd take the subway into Manhattan, go up to his store, and I could see the appointment chart on the wall getting emptier and emptier. And more often when I'd visit the shop, he'd be sitting in one of the barber chairs rather than cutting somebody's hair. And it was only a matter of time.
What did he make of that?
He was a pretty nutsy, boltsy, realistic kind of guy. He couldn't make the men of America start to get their haircuts more. He tried all kinds of small side hustles, sold more things in the shop so that people who would come in, and he'd get foot traffic even if people weren't coming for a haircut. He sold grooming supplies and cigarettes and stuff like that. And after a while, just couldn't make a go of it any longer.
You've become one of the best known journalists, and certainly radio journalists of your generation. Were you brought up in that American dream model of making something of yourself?
You know, it was kind of a push and pull thing. Our asses were so close to the flames that we could only march forward. And there was a very strong sense that nobody was going to do us any favors. Nobody was really going to give us a hand up. So we had to make our own way in the world. And I took that message, you might say, in mother's milk, in the water that came from the taps in our apartment in Brooklyn. The idea that you had to go to college, you had to get a line of work that would pay you a decent salary, that life was not easy, and that even though we understood life wasn't easy, we should also enjoy ourselves too. So, yeah, I guess I got a lot of very strong messages about work and the value of work and the centrality of work very young.
In a sense, that sounds like a rather conservative message or a conservative system of values, and yet you're not a conservative fellow.
And maybe in ways that aren't apparent, I am. Certainly in the 60s and 70s, a working class kid in Brooklyn could look around and see models that he or she could not participate in that were either attractive or repulsive. And for instance, the real counterculture seemed to us in our neighborhood to be a luxury that only middle class and upper middle class kids could afford. People in my neighborhood weren't burning draft cards, they were getting drafted. They didn't have college deferments. They couldn't keep themselves out of Vietnam by having a smart doctor or a smart lawyer talk them out of it on behalf of their families. So, I mean, it might read as conservative. I think it was more a working class, chip on shoulder ethic about propriety, about what you look like on the street, about reputation, about taking care of what's yours, because we lived in a very public culture where people saw you come and go, and if you looked shabby and looked no account, neighbors would know. It's a kind of culture that's hard to replicate in a world of big broad lawns and detached single-family houses. Apartment world is a different world. It's a sidewalk world.
Of course, you've seen Francis Ford Coppola's Godfather. I'm sure you've seen it more than once. I'm romanticizing, or perhaps unromanticizing your background, but was that the world in a sense you grew up with? A family rather close, suspicion of the state?
Yeah, I think that's fair. It wasn't suspicion of the state as much as a total lack of belief that the state was going to do much for us. My father had been in the Navy. He joined right out of high school. He did his service. He was on active duty when I was born, actually. He was in the Philippines, and I was emerging into the world in New York City. So I think there was an undercurrent of patriotism, not overt and rah-rah and flag-wavy, but sort of valuing the country, and at the same time recognizing that nobody was going to care about you except your family.
What about the New Deal and that idea, the FDR idea, which later was, I suppose, modernized by Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society? Was this something that had any impact on your parents, on your father? Were they Democrats?
Well, my mother was a union member and got a union pension at the end of her years with the Board of Education in the city of New York. My father had to self-fund a pension. As a storekeeper and as a barber, there's no barber's union making sure that you charge a certain amount for a haircut or have a guaranteed defined benefit package waiting for you at the end of it all. So there was a mix of trust that the state would be there for you, I guess, at the end of your life. My father now lives with no small amount of support from the Veterans Administration because of his years in the military in the 1950s, something for which he's tremendously grateful. So I guess it's a mixed bag of self-reliance, the belief that the cavalry was not coming over the hill to save you, and at the same time a sort of undertow of trust that when things really got bad, it would be there.
Did the family have a political hero, an FDR, a JFK, a Reagan?
I think my parents were both born at the end of the 30s, so JFK was a big personality in their lives. The first time they were both able to vote, they voted in the Kennedy-Eisenhower election. My mother, there's some great pictures of my mother from the early 1960s wearing a Jackie Kennedy hat because she was a tremendously influential style icon in the White House years. So there's a picture of my mother with her hair done like Jackie and wearing a hat like Jackie. She wrote a condolence letter to the White House after the killing of John F. Kennedy, and we got a note back from Jackie Kennedy that still is held on to as a talisman by my family. I think, yeah, they were big fans of JFK because they were of the generation that would have been.
But they believed in politics, they believed in leadership, they believed that things could be for the best.
You know, I don't know if they would ever have thought about it or described it that way. They were institutionalists. They believed in the heft and solidity and importance of institutions. My mother, all during my growing up, was a poll worker. So on election day, I used to go by the polls and make a little extra money by buying all the poll ladies their sandwiches. They'd write out a long list, they'd give me money, I'd run to the local deli, bring back drinks and sandwiches, and then at the end of the day, I could, since I was little, go behind the machine with the poll judges and watch how they tabulated the polls. Those are the kind of things that really make a big impression on a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old. And I feel like I've always been interested in politics as a result. I mean, their politics were the politics of propriety more than anything else.
Decency, proprietary.
Yeah. I mean, my father, because of the work he did, thought it would be a shame if I was seen with long hair. So all during the big long hair years, I didn't really have long hair because my father would just sit me down in a chair and cut it off. When I started to grow whiskers, he plopped me down in a chair and rather abruptly shaved me, which was a shock, with a straight edge razor. So we, as a family, certainly my parents as a couple, put a great deal of stock in what other people saw. If I was seen drunk coming home from the train to our apartment building, they would have been mortified. If I was seen hanging out with a crummy crowd, I think they would have been really embarrassed. There was a lot of that because that's all we had. We didn't have status or money or position of any kind. So pride in your public presentation was one of the things that we could control and one of the things we did have as a possession.
Reputation, then, might be.
Reputation, absolutely.
You have gone on to become, as I said, one of the voices, the media voices, certainly of my generation. I grew up listening to you on NPR. A word that I would use to be associated with you, you always wore your politics quite clearly on your sleeve, so you never claimed to be unbiased, but trust, I think, is an important word that goes together with that late 20th century mainstream media. Do you think that the trust that you successfully sort of knitted into your brand, was that in some odd way connected with your background, the values of reputation and respect that you grew up with in your family? It may not have been ideological, but more cultural.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that early idea that I was raised with, that to a degree you are what people see, that sets some ideas in motion that maybe even subconsciously carry you through your growing up years and into your development as an adult. I never wanted people to turn on the radio or turn on the television and wonder if I was telling them the truth. And I think I managed to be credible, to be thought of as an honest person, to never misrepresent the things that I was reporting about, and always, and this is really important to me, always humane, because I thought that it was an important value in the kind of work we did. Because when people let you into their lives and they tell you things that are really sometimes are harmful to them to tell you, that hurt them to come out of their own mouths, they're trusting you in a really fundamental way. And what you do with that trust, whether you exploit them and turn them into things or use them as part of your story and turn them into people, real people who are seen by others and heard by others, to illustrate part of the human condition. It's a big difference there. And it's always been a difference that's important to me.
Who were or are your journalistic heroes? Who are you trying to emulate?
I don't know. Ernie Pyle, the great war correspondent.
The Cronkites of the world, the dominant figures of the 50s and 60s.
Sure. I mean, they created a model that I always thought would be good to emulate. Because there were so few Latinos in television and on national radio when I was first thinking about whether I could make a living doing this, there were few people who I could look to and say, well, if he could do it, if she can do it, then I can do it. In some ways, I had to invent my own path. And it wasn't, that's not a terrible thing. It's just the way it was.
Maybe then you look more to what, entertainers, sportsmen?
No, I never really consciously modeled either the kinds of things I was covering, the things that interested and animated me, or the style in which I did it on anybody else.
This is an impossible question to answer, Ray, so I'm not actually sure why I'm asking it, but I will ask it. I mean, what comes first in terms of causality? Is it the broader culture of people like your parents with their values, their reputation, their respect, their trust? Or is it the media of Ernie Pyles and Walter Cronkites and Alistair Cooks that seem to both create and reflect that culture? Or is it, are the two worlds of mainstream top-down media and the second half of the 20th century, are they so tangled up together that they're hard to actually separate?
I wouldn't say tangled up as much as cross-pollinating. They couldn't exist without each other. They're symbiotic. And, your times shape you to a degree that's sometimes only possible to assess in retrospect. And you shape the times by story selection, about the way you go about your business. You're explaining the world to people. That's a big responsibility. And if you take it seriously, it's a product both of your times, the platform on which you stand to tell those stories, and also how it's received. The audience, the reader, the listener, the viewer, is a crucial connector in this. It's not simply a one-way process. So I've always thought that it's as impossible to separate those aspects from each other as it would be to get the sugar out of a cup of coffee after you've mistakenly put it into someone's cup who says, I don't want any sugar.
You'd have to pour a new cup. Should we be nostalgic, Ray, for the world that you're describing? Not the world of your parents, because it's different, but the world of a trusted mainstream media journalist, a guy like yourself, the world that people like Ernie Pyle created. Obviously, in career terms, perhaps some people are nostalgic. Some people think that it was a world where women and minorities weren't represented. You've already touched on that. You were the first, probably well-known mainstream media journalist who was of Hispanic origin. Is there any element of nostalgia, both personally for you and more broadly in an intellectual sense?
I think the nostalgia is sometimes a little misplaced, because while there was something good and socially useful about a consensus culture where 90% of the televisions watched one of the 3 network news shows in the evening, it created a consensus world. That had some good aspects, because then we could argue about, well, here's what the world is, what do we do about it?
And yet, right, sorry to jump in here, but you were just talking about the counterculture, which is about as unconsensual, if there's such a word, as anything in American history.
Sure, but you got to wonder how, certainly in the first glimmerings, the Summer of Love and all that, it was still a small percentage of American youth. Most people didn't go to post-secondary school. They left high school and went to work or into the service. This idea that everybody tuned in, turned on, and dropped out was really a distortion of what was happening on the main streets of county seats across Missouri and Indiana and Ohio. That wasn't what was happening. It was happening perhaps on the main campus of the big state university, so in Ann Arbor and State College, PA, and places like that, Berkeley, but it was happening in places like Berkeley and State College, Pennsylvania, and Ann Arbor,
so
Michigan.
and I apologize, I jumped in terms of the broader issue of nostalgia.
Well, that we mistake the consensus culture for the notion that they were telling us everything, or that they were telling us the truth. There were a lot of things that were simply overlooked, or a lot of embedded values that were assumed rather than questioned. There was massive disinvestment in American cities after 1950. And full-scale, rapid deindustrialization of America's urban areas for a variety of reasons. And then a tsunami of subsidies that went into building suburban America. With a media that is meant to be popular in order to make money, who's going to be the discouraging voice that says, hey, hold on a minute. Maybe we don't have to destroy the cities in order to build the suburbs. There were a tremendous number of embedded assumptions that because they were part of this news cultural consensus, we took as self-evident, we took as self-explanatory. We didn't do enough to question their wisdom, question where it would take us in the out years. We just watched it happen, and because everybody kind of agreed it was okay, that everybody should have a car, that there should be highways punched through the hearts of American cities, that the federal government should be a tremendous transfer point for wealth. It was just in the air, it was in the water, and it wasn't really questioned, it wasn't interrogated to the degree it should have been.
And of course, there's the cultural or the racial element there. These suburbs tended to be white. No surprise that the cities became more and more black or brown. Levittown, for example, I mean, it was one of the early suburbs. I don't think they even allowed African Americans.
Levittown specifically forbid black people.
Which is quite astonishing. So it may not be the new Jim Crow, but it was certainly a new kind of segregation. You've just written this wonderful oral history of, let's say, hyphenated America, Ray. Was there this sense in the people you talked to that the period we're talking about, the last half of the 20th century, was one where there still was this sort of implicit degree of segregation, where their voices, their faces, their races weren't represented in America? It was still very much a white America.
You know, in the 1960 census, America hit the modern low point of the percentage of foreign-born Americans in the society. In the 1960 census, only 5% of Americans were born in another country. And now, it's something around 14%. And what happened in the middle was the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which changed everything. And when you are driving in a suburb outside Chicago and see minarets pointing to the sky, a big suburban mosque with a big parking lot, outside Dallas, in Frisco, Texas, an enormous Hindu temple. That's a product of that 1965 law. It changed the racial makeup of the country, it changed the ethnic makeup of the country, and inevitably changed the religious makeup of the country in ways that we're still kind of coming to terms with now. When men with torches march around a statue of Robert E. Lee and chant, "You will not replace us," it illustrates some of the anxiety that white people, often young white men, are willing to show it publicly. The anxiety that white people have about becoming just one big group inside society instead of the essential group inside society.
Ray, you've had a front seat on these changes in America. I mean, you did the Daily Show for years, ever since I began listening to NPR. When did you begin to understand that things were changing dramatically? I mean, it always seems as if things are changing, but were there moments, times, the election of Reagan, for example, 9/11, the Clinton years, where you began to scratch your head and think, something profound is changing, that the America I grew up with is reinventing itself, it's renewing itself, or we're just losing that?
Well, fortunately for me, I got to see some of these hinge points. I was on the runway at Houari Boumediene Airport in Algiers when the American hostages got off the plane from Tehran. I was in Crystal City in Los Angeles after the 1984 count came in and Ronald Reagan came out on stage and took the accolades of an absolutely rapturous audience that were glad he was going to be around for another 4 years. Interviewed leaders of the Contras who were receiving illegal funding from the United States government to carry on a civil war in Nicaragua. Met or interviewed most of the men who've run for president in the last 40 years. So, yeah, there have been a lot of times. I was working as a reporter in Chicago when the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the Simpson-Mazzoli law, came into force in 1986. And out of the woodwork came people who had been hiding from authorities for years as a sort of second skin, hiding from detection about fiddly social security numbers or not quite right home addresses and so on, and watched their desire to get legal in America, come out of the shadows, make sure their children's security was guaranteed. And they came from everywhere. There was a stereotype that they were all from Mexico. They were from everywhere. Belize, Algeria, Ireland, Eastern Europe. It was really remarkable. I was just about to go into Poland when I was working as a correspondent in Rome. After weeks of haggling with the Polish embassy, I finally got a visa, and then martial law came into Warsaw. It was shut, and I could no longer go into the country. And though I wasn't on the streets of Warsaw, it felt like I was, really sitting at the front seat. I was at one of the biggest demonstrations in history against American weaponry in Rome when the United States was going to put short-range nuclear missiles in Europe to face the same, pointing toward Western Europe in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Bloc. It's been a kind of amazing, transformational set of decades, and all the rules are being rewritten. All the verities are being challenged. All the assumptions are being just tossed upside down. Maybe that's good, maybe that's necessary, maybe it's the kind of thing that makes history move forward, but it's tough to live through. And if you ask anybody who used to work in the plant or the mill in town, and it's been shuttered for years, and the carcass and the smokestack is still standing there as a sort of daily mockery of you as you struggle to make a living, those changes can really be wrenching. And you get to see the middle class that's growing in places all around the world that's created by this modern economy. I recently spent some time living in China for a lot of reasons, good and bad. It's one of the most remarkable places on the planet and will likely remain that for some time to come. So I feel very lucky, very privileged as a reporter that I've gotten to be up close against some of these events. That South Africa was able to get rid of apartheid without having a full-on civil war we should be patting ourselves on the back every day. I was at Nelson Mandela's last rally of his campaign for president in a soccer stadium in Durban. I thought the place was going to lift off the ground. 90,000 people shouting at the top of their lungs in response to his call and response, Amandla. We are in one of those periods in history. I guess the 14th century was like this. The second half of the 19th century was like this. We are in a renegotiation period. And when the dust settles, the world might look very different from the way it did when the Berlin Wall fell.
Let me revise the question slightly, Ray. You brought up the Immigration Act of the mid-60s, and I think you've made the argument before in our conversations in your oral history that it might have been the most significant act of the last part of the 20th century, and yet nobody still thinks about it. And when everyone thinks of the 60s, they think of the Civil Rights Act or Johnson's Great Society. How does history work? Not just in broad sense, but for journalists, how do you know when something's important? Even today, that Immigration Act barely gets talked about, either from pro-immigration people, the Harris camp, or Trump, whose whole campaign seems to be opposed to immigration, yet I don't think he even knows of that mid-60s act.
One of the things that got me animated by this topic was how little people knew about it. I started to dig in, and I started to look at both the legislative history, the debates about how it got passed, and then what it did in the censuses of 1980, 1990, 2000. And people would say, hey, what are you working on? And I say, well, I got a proposal with publishers about the aftermath of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And they'd say, what's that? Is it really important? I've never heard of it. Tell me about it. And, as a journalist, when you think you've got your teeth in a a great yarn, and the first 20 people you mention it to have no idea what you're talking about, that can either have you saying, well, maybe there's not much there because it's not commercial, or maybe this is a story that really needs to be told because this is it's made the world that America will become in mid-century. And I chose, obviously, the latter rather than the former. I think it's a good example, as I suspect you're getting at with your question, of what we end up thinking is important.
We never quite know. I mean, history is a funny thing, isn't it? And what seems important. I mean, even 1989, at the time, in 1989, when the wall fell, and you covered that, as you said earlier, you'd have said to yourself, well, this is the hinge year in world history, the end of communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and yet now when we look back historically, maybe the most significant event in 1989 was unknown, Tim Berners-Lee's invention of the World Wide Web. So things are just odd, aren't they?
Well, history runs on multiple levels. I mean, it's unquestionable if you're sitting in Kyiv or Lviv today that the fall of the Berlin Wall was a hinge point in history, one that you're going to have to be dealing with if you're a young adult through the rest of your life. And yes, undeniably, the development of the World Wide Web is another one. Maybe they take a little bit longer to show themselves, certain developments, but certainly for a Cold War kid like me, who spent his elementary school years climbing under the desk periodically throughout the school year in the crazy belief that somehow this would help save my life if the big one fell on Wall Street 10 miles away. Yeah, it seemed like a pretty big screaming deal to me when the Berlin Wall came down.
Right. For a Cold War kid like yourself, as you describe yourself, had you, so to speak, fallen asleep in 1989 after the wall came down and then woke up 35 years later in 2024, remembering that Cold War kid, what you were in 1989, what do you think you'd be most surprised about America in 2024? I know it's an unfair question, but...
Well, I mean, the idea that prominent Republican elected officials can't be complimentary enough of Russia. Sometimes it's backhanded praise, but it's praise nonetheless for Vladimir Putin. That would be shocking. There was nobody in America who said good things about Brezhnev in the 1970s. It would have been anathema in the late 50s and early 60s to heap praise on Nikita Khrushchev. And yet, when you see in online communication, people who support the Republican Party also saying that Vladimir Putin is a defender of Christianity, a defender of white civilization, a defender of European history. It scrambles your eggs. It's amazing. And no, the 1989 version of me would have found that hard to believe, especially since the Republican Party was the bellows that kept the Cold War fire hot during all the years that I was a kid. I mean, certainly the Democrats had played their part too, but the John Birch Society was not a Democratic club.
And had one of your colleagues in 1989 said to you, in 35 years' time, an elected Republican president would encourage a mob to storm Congress and question an election which every legitimate election official said was truthful, what would you have made of that?
I would have found it impossible to believe, really. But one thing that I never could have imagined was the degree to which propriety as a part of our public performance of politics would have simply been discarded. It's no longer part of the game at all. Not as gesture, not as understood to be the necessary thing, sort of ritual thing that you do in order to be taken seriously in other realms. It's just off the table. And no, it would have been unimaginable. And I was at the Capitol on January 6th, and I knew nothing good was coming from that. I mean, I was by myself and I had all my gear, and I thought, boy, who's going to care if a freelance gets his stuff busted and gets beat up? And I left. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, but I did. And but I knew bad things were happening, and I also knew that there was no attempt to discourage these people, no attempt to dissuade them from their course of action. The last live shot I did before I packed up my stuff and left, a circle of these knuckleheads stood around me and screamed, "Traitor and liar."
At you?
At me, yeah.
And did they know who you were?
They had some sense that I was
They just thought you were just another mainstream media.
Yeah, a couple of them recognized me. "You're that guy," and I said, "Yeah, I'm that guy,
Mr. NPO."
but you know, two things I'm not: is a liar and a traitor. And I thought, nah, this is getting a little ugly, and I got out of there. You know, I had not long before had cancer and was feeling a little fragile, and I thought, I'll watch this on TV, which I did with rising horror. But that idea that you could bend reality to your will, that's phalangist shit. That's stuff that doesn't belong in our system, doesn't belong in our culture, and has unfortunately become a modern feature of our politics.
I got the headline for this interview, Ray. It's going to be phalangist shit, no more phalangist shit. You talked about the end of proprietary, and the way you presented your parents, they were models of proprietary, both in their behavior and how they brought you up. Trump, of course, perhaps can be summarized by his distaste for any kind of proprietary, but it's more than that, isn't it, in terms of the changes since '89? It's our influence of society, it's the internet, it's the showiness of life. Your parents and people of their generation, and perhaps even people like yourself brought up with their values, they must be disappointed. Maybe that's a euphemism for what's happened.
Well, disappointed, shocked, dismayed. I was with my father the other day. He's 86 years old, and he just shook his head. He couldn't believe we were watching a speech by Donald Trump, and he just couldn't believe it. And this guy is a small C conservative from his head to his toes in a lot of ways. Certainly in his belief that people should behave in a certain way, because it's the glue that keeps everything from flying into chaos. I think people of my parents' generation believed that without even being able to give name to it. They understood it in their bones, that this is a kind of fragile thing we're doing here that only works because everybody sort of looks out of the corner of their eye at everybody else and marches forward in the way that they're supposed to.
You're a media guy, Ray. You lived through all these great changes. A lot of books have been written. I've written some myself, suggesting that the internet is responsible for some of these problems. What's your take on the role of the digital revolution in the undermining of proprietary, in the rise of Trumpism and populism, in people's lack of respect for one another? Some people call social media anti-social media.
Well, I'm going to disappoint you by not having a simple answer. I think the internet has done a great many contrary things. It's made it possible to know more things about more things than was ever possible ever in the history of the world, and that should amaze us every day. It's like the Library of Alexandria times 10,000.
In everyone's
at your
pocket.
Fingertips.
It's not in our fingertips. We all carry it around in our pocket.
Absolutely.
Even on our wrists these days.
And so the assumption is a very animating assumption that it's possible to know about anything. If people ask you what the capital of the Ivory Coast is, you can find that out. If somebody asks you what Mickey Mantle batted in 1956, you can find that out. You can find out what the major exports of Peru and Bolivia are. You can find out anything about anything almost immediately. But that tremendous power, that almost unimaginable reach, also makes it possible to lie to more people about more things in a persuasive way than was ever possible in the history of the world before. It took our old late 20th century heads and scrambled them up like an egg beater, where we had everyone walked around with a trust network. And who was in your trust network? People you knew, your neighbor, maybe somebody you worked with. They seemed credible. They seemed to know what they were talking about. Walter Cronkite.
Ernie Pyle.
And from that trust network, you built a world. You built a working model of the world that got you through your day and through your week. Now, who's in your trust network? People who will easily lie to you. People who will tell you up is down and black is white and fully expect you to believe it. There is an industry that is as powerful and influential and as well crafted that is an untruth industry. And instead of the untruth industry being a weak and less persuasive opponent to the truth industry, now the untruth industry is just as popular, just as powerful, and just as well produced as the truth industry. And it's given us, we haven't caught up in our heads in the way we make up our minds about the world. We haven't caught up with the power of that untruth industry yet, and we'll probably be dealing with it for decades to come. And AI is only pushing down the accelerator. When you can see a credible-looking piece of video with credible sound coming out of the mouth of that talking person that is absolutely fabricated, that's a scary moment.
I don't want to make you seem too old, Ray, but I don't want to turn you into Ernie Pyle or Cronkite or Alistair Cook, but you do represent the other model, that deeply trustworthy model. I mean, we can spend hours talking about Trump and right-wing media and Fox News and all the rest of it, but hasn't it also happened amongst progressives? There isn't a Ray Suarez around today, but there is a Ray Suarez, but when it comes to progressive media stars, it's Rachel Maddow, it's Joe Scarborough. They're telling a different message, but it's a similar kind of almost religious relationship with their followers. They're not giving the people watching them a lot of credit for thinking for themselves.
Well, I would differ in your diagnosis in one key way. Rachel Maddow does care if you find out that she was wrong, and does have an interest and believes that her credibility relies on her not being wrong all the time. Her opposite number, whoever that may be.
Well, it might be Tucker Carlson.
Let's use Tucker Carlson as an example.
And in the news today, this will go out in a few days, but Tucker Carlson on his online show allowed a Holocaust denier on who argued that Churchill did more harm in the Second World War than Adolf Hitler.
Good example, and let me expand on that example a little bit because I think it's important. The goal line is being moved as we speak. In the recent past, when people have given space and room and credibility to Holocaust deniers, it's not right in the moment, during their program. Where Tucker Carlson has moved the goal line is he's allowed this person on his program without giving himself the plausible deniability of saying, well, that wasn't what we were talking about, or I didn't ask him his opinion on the Holocaust, or to plead ignorance and say, oh, I didn't know he had written these terrible things. He invited him to expand on that idea, that the Jews of Europe were in effect prisoners of war, and in the words of this Holocaust denier, ended up dead. in this passive construction. No, they weren't killed in industrial fashion by the Nazis. No, they ended up dead, as if some magical malign force had worked on them and routed them out of their homes and seized their businesses and killed their children. I mean, it's the most appalling thing. He's like a cat that has 90 lives instead of 9 lives. Every time he does something that so thoroughly lacks credibility that you almost have to giggle at it. You think, well, this is it, his goose is cooked. If I did something like this, it would be the end of me. But it's never the end of him. He just seems to continue to fail upward. The man who said in private communications that he hates Donald Trump and can't wait until he doesn't have to talk about him anymore was a featured speaker at the Republican National Convention. That's the degree to which reality no longer intrudes or weighs down that world.
Yeah, people don't, I mean, Trump is a master at this. You no longer have histories. J.D. Vance has done the same thing.
Your own past, even if it's on video and audio, just doesn't matter. You can deny that yesterday happened and just move on as if it hadn't. It's a remarkable thing, and it's very much to be discouraged.
Right. Orwell, of course, wrote about that in 1984, so it's not necessarily a new thing. Ray, you've been very generous with your time. I'm not going to keep you too much longer, but what else, aside from media, what are the other 1 or 2 most profound, troubling, or perhaps uplifting changes in America since '89? What about the issue of the neoliberal economy and more inequality? Is that something that you think has profoundly changed the America, especially the America you know, the hyphenated America you've grown up with, you've just written a book about?
You know, I don't know how big a fan of Roadrunner cartoons you are.
Well, I know them.
There's an important moment in every Roadrunner cartoon where Wile E. Coyote, his arch nemesis, runs off a cliff but does not fall until he realizes he's run off a cliff. And you may say to yourself, what does that have to do with the question I just asked? Well, I'll tell you. I think America really lucked out when its striving millions were being led over a cliff but still believed that they were running forward. Until they realized that they had run off the cliff, they didn't fall. We offshored jobs. We offshored entire industries. We changed the way we stock our material lives with the things of everyday life. We changed how people made a living. We changed what people thought was what would be possible for people. And then we didn't tell them we were doing it. And we didn't tell them how things were going to change, and told them, look, as long as stuff is cheap when you go to the store, nothing to worry about. Well, now we are reaping the whirlwind. We're reaping the whirlwind from the 80s and 90s of all these rapid economic changes where we didn't really level with people about what the downstream consequences of all this was. And that's why it's a snarly, angry, discouraged time. Not for no reason. It's not just a bunch of yokels who don't realize what's up. They understand that something really significant has gone wrong with the country. They can't always put words to it. They don't always recall, because, you know, why would a 32-year-old worker remember something that happened when he was 6 months old? Like the passage of NAFTA or the negotiation of NAFTA. But now we're reaping the whirlwind for all of it, and nobody wants to own up to what they did. So the Republicans are acting like they weren't the party of low and no tariffs, and of offshoring, and of global supply chains. Who, us? Oh, we had nothing. We had nothing to do with that. In the 90s, the early 90s, I interviewed Alex Trotman, who was the worldwide chairman of Ford Motor. And I said to him, well, should an American care when they walk into a Ford showroom and look at a car, how much of that car was made in the United States? And he said he didn't care, and neither should they. I was interviewing a Secretary of the Treasury, and I asked him, well, if you're living in Ohio, Should you want to buy a car that's made in Japan, or should you favor a Honda, where the engine is made in Maryville, Ohio, all the sheet metal is made in Northeast Indiana? Should that matter to you? He said, absolutely not. I said, even if the two cars are of equal quality and similar price, he said, that should be the last thing on your mind when you go into a showroom. And I said, supporting your own neighbors and their jobs? And he said, yes, a Republican Secretary of the Treasury.
Although, and I don't want to continue this because I've got a couple of other questions. Clinton might have responded, or somebody in Clinton's administration might have said exactly the same thing.
Sure. But now there's only one party that's pretending that they don't know what happened and they don't know how somebody else got away with it. And I want both our parties to be honest about what we did in this country in the most recent decades. And we've got a candidate for president promising 100% tariff on Chinese goods. What that tells me is that the guy hasn't been in a Costco or a Walmart or a Sam's Club or a Track Auto or any store like that in the recent past, and has no idea where the things that he uses every day have been made, except for maybe his own neckties and the suit jackets of his own branded suits.
So you're saying there's no Costco in Mar-a-Lago?
Probably not.
Ray, you've got kids as well. We began this conversation talking about your own childhood, your relationship with your parents. It's hard not to be anecdotal. I've got kids too, but when one speaks to people of our generation with teenage kids, slightly older kids, there's this sense that something has changed about being young in America. With books, many books are now being written about the age of anxiety, of uncertainty, of the lack of confidence, a new kind of generational war, kind of the reverse of the 60s that put your father out of business because everyone was growing their hair. Now the only work is probably for therapists. Has something profoundly changed, or is it just more media paranoia?
I get to see it pretty regularly because I have 3 kids, and there's an age spread from 35 to 24. My 35-year-old, he is in international business and doing quite well. He's going to make me a grandfather for the first time in a few months. Thank you very much. And that's all upside and joy. My middle child is an Episcopal priest. And while she is, I would say, an optimistic, hopeful, and idealistic person, she receives the incoming fire from her congregants who are suffering all manner of dislocation and discouragement and anxiety about what the future holds. And my youngest kid is 24, and she is fully burdened with the idea that the world is not going to be a very livable place in her middle adult years. That, well, she says, your generation has screwed up the world, to me and my wife. And we say, well, yes, that's true. We have screwed up the world. No use arguing about that. The world is in a pretty dire situation. Yet, I said, look, we had you. Having a child is an act of hope. It is an act of hope from beginning to end. From the first time that little strip shows up on the pregnancy test to the time that you come home from the hospital with a kid. It's totally an act of hope. And we were hopeful when we had you, and you should do the same. She says she's not going to have children because the world is too screwed up, and I think a lot of her friends feel the same way. So I get to see the whole range of that worry about the future among young people, because all their friends, I love their group of friends, all 3 of them, but they express what's going on right now in the early 21st century as well, in their range of experiences, joys, and heartaches.
Probably the middle one is continued in the Ray Suarez tradition more than any of them, maybe.
Well, she's a great writer and a great preacher, and more than once people have suggested, well, she gets it all from you. And I say, that's not fair. She's a great creative person on her own right.
Yeah, and I'm sure her mother would have something to do with it as well. Ray, again, you don't need me to tell you this, the American Republic will be celebrating, if that's the right word, its 250th anniversary, July 4th, 2026. Hopefully there'll still be a republic, a democracy, who knows. What are you going to be doing then? You'll be flag waving? What do you think your kids will be doing?
Well, I'll be marking my 50th year in the news business, to the extent I'm still working in 2026.
No more riots, I hope.
I hope not. I hope it's a time for us to take stock of what's been remarkable and unimaginable about the confection, the contrivance that is the United States. A country not based on blood and clan and origin, but on a set of ideas and propositions that has worked pretty well for a long time. And if there's been a momentum, it's been toward opening the door further and further for the free expression and the fully living into human rights and the individual joy of the striving, aspiring human being. It's an amazing place, and I hope we appreciate that. I hope we're eyes open about what the crises are that face us as a people, and I hope we are brave enough to both admit to ourselves what hasn't been so admirable about our past, while at the same time being fully ready to set off the fireworks and wave the flags for the amazing, wonderful things about America too. We can do both. I think we can be mature enough to do both.
And finally, Ray, 1976 now seems centuries ago, as we discussed. The America of 2024 or 2026 is dramatically different, in some ways a different country from the America of 1976. What about 2076? Hopefully you and I will be around, although it's unlikely. Very, very briefly, to end this conversation, where does America need to aspire to? Should it be thinking of retreating to some of the values of your parents' generation? Or are there still new vistas, new opportunities, new kinds of regeneration and renewal that nobody in the 2020s has even imagined?
I would hope that by 2076 we have lived into and gotten comfortable with the idea of our role as the great ingatherer of nations. We're an amazing people, an amazing place. And every time someone whose ancestors came from Asia, Africa, or Latin America and says something like Barack Obama said, no place else in the world is my story possible, that's true. And we should love that. And we should love the fact that that's what we've become to the world. There are people sitting now in Abidjan and Freetown, Sierra Leone, and Addis Ababa and Mexico City and Sao Paulo, Brazil, saying, boy, I'd really like to get to the United States. I'd really like to try myself out there. That's a great thing. And hopefully some of the misgivings of the moment about it, which I think are born of discouragement. A confident people doesn't say, slam the door. Let's slam the door and not let anybody else in. A confident people says, you think you got something to offer? Yeah. Let's try you out. I think we'll look a little different. The way we eat will be a little different. The way the music sounds when we turn on whatever 2076's version of the radio is. The way we dance will be different. And in a lot of ways, I hope, we'll still essentially be what we are now. You're an immigrant. In other places in the world, people make fun of Americans, sometimes affectionately, sometimes dismissively, as open, wide-eyed, idealistic, optimistic. An issue of Granta, that I'll never forget, shows a big smile on the cover and says, that's the American trademark, a smile. In part because our dentistry is pretty good compared with a lot of other places on the planet, and because if you ask people in other places what Americans are like, they'll probably say two things. They smile, they're friendly, and they're fat. And maybe we can address some of those things. Keep on smiling and slim down a little bit.
Wow, Ray Suarez, an American institution. Thank you so much for appearing on Keen on America. It's a real honor, and we're going to get you back on in 2076 to see whether Americans are smiling less and maybe have lost a bit of weight. Thank you so much.
But then I won't have to come back. We can just telepathically go right into their brains.